This is an incredibly important conversation, and I really am honored to be a part of it, and along with my distinguished panelists. So I had a full PowerPoint deck, but I think it'd be easier given the other folks who are here and who all, I think you generally all know what I'm going to be talking about, to just kind of have a conversation. So what I want to talk about today is lying. In the 3.5 years of my tenure at the National Council of Canadian Muslims, what became quite clear was that much of our work, much of the advocacy work, could in some ways philosophically be distilled down to a simple question around folks who are wanting to tell. We were seeking for the truth to be told to us, and others chose to lie, or it was unclear as to whether they were going to be telling the truth or whether the truth would ever be forthcoming. I think that fundamentally, many of the questions that Canadian Muslims have had since 9/11 have fundamentally had to do with our engagement with national security agencies and our perspectives that they are not necessarily being forthcoming, telling us the truth, or finding out that there was a obfuscation or a lie. This question and this erosion was simultaneously paired with the fact that many of our national security agencies perceived Canadian Muslims to also be lying, to also not be forthcoming. And this tension of truth versus lies is played out constantly, including, of course, in the House of Commons and the Senate, where the notion that Canadian Muslims were constantly lying about a fifth column of terrorists who remains in Canada, about protecting those who were allegedly planning plots, about supporting tyrannical, patriarchal, or otherwise, evil conceptions, is constantly at play. And I think it's constantly at play, pretty much all the time. Even throughout the last week, we saw prominent Canadian Muslim journalists be attacked, even in the venerable Toronto Star, for having the audacity to wear a headscarf and being called up by name, because somehow this sort of is perhaps seen as standing with the Iranian regime. And it's this kind of focus on lying, doublespeak, who's telling the truth, who can we take as an authoritative source of knowledge and truth, I think is one of the fundamental kind of philosophical discussions in the law. And I think one of the most powerful ways in which we can see that is in relation to CSIS and the duty of candor. Now, of course, the duty of candor has a very specific legal jurisprudential conception. But I think at the heart of it, we have to think about how national security agencies are often in the business of obfuscating. We only had to look to earlier in the last month, where our Prime Minister stood behind the country's top civilian agency, CSIS, in relation to the allegation that one of its contractors helped traffic 3 British teenage girls, of course, one of whom was Shamima Begum, to ISIS 7 years ago. Now, of course, I think one of the ways, and I know that we all know the story of Shamima Begum, so I'm not going to, waste all of your time by telling you about it. But I think one of the most fascinating parts from my perspective was how the story of Shamima Begum plays out like a conspiracy theory. It plays out like the conspiracy theory that I grew up in, in the houses of uncles and aunts who just couldn't fundamentally understand the truth of what was being told to them, who couldn't believe or accept that, that people were going from Western countries to fight for ISIS, it just struck them as something that was an impossibility. And yet the story of Shamima Begum plays out in a way that seems vaguely conspiratorial. where a Canadian handler or a handler who, under the auspices of a national security agency, actively smuggled these folks to go fight for Daesh. And when they went to go fight for Daesh, the upending conversation around whether Shamima Begum deserved to keep her citizenship played back out in Canadian circles, where, of course, the Harper government tabled, after the United Kingdom did, legislation that would help strip citizenship from Canadian citizens who are caught, for example, in aiding and abetting in Daesh. So there's a weird transformational way in which you have a security agency who assisted in sending abroad somebody who would become the focal point of the UK citizenship discussion, which then circumvented its way back to Canada, where it became a matter of legislation and a major set of discussions. And yet, the folks at the heart of this problem will bear no consequence. Because according to the Prime Minister, and as he said last month, the fight against, and I'm quoting, the fight against terrorism requires our intelligence services to continue to be flexible and to be creative in their approaches. This notion of flexibility and creativity, when it comes to essentially running an operation that resulted in a massive attack on the integrity of our systems and on the integrity of citizenship in Canada, tells you everything that you need to know in terms of lying and in terms of what that means in terms of being forthright from our national security agencies, and as it goes up and up and up throughout our political systems. Let's dive right then into the question of the duty of candor. I think one of the ways in which we've seen the duty of candor play out most recently was in the recent 2020 decision by Justice Patrick Gleeson from the Federal Court of Canada. Now, in his 151-page ruling, Justice Gleeson slammed CSIS for what he called its cavalier institutional approach to the question of the duty of candor and to the rule of law, noting that the disregard of the duty of candor is part of a long-standing pattern that goes back years. Justice Gleeson criticized CSIS and its leaders for disregarding warnings from federal lawyers about the illegal character of the collection activities it had undertaken. CSIS not only conducted these high-risk operations, which on their face were illegal and not authorized by the CSIS Act. After government lawyers warned that it could not rely on Crown immunity, it also did not inform the court about the illegally obtained information when seeking warrants, according to Justice Gleeson's decision. This was also done with the apparent acquiescence of federal lawyers. These circumstances, according to Justice Gleeson, raised fundamental questions relating to respect for the rule of law, the oversight of security intelligence agencies, and the actions of individual decision makers. And again, when we're thinking about the duty of candor and its obligations, what that really means to us is that CSIS owes obligations to courts by identifying and disclosing to the courts its reliance on information that was and how that information was obtained. Now, of course, it's important to recognize that there was a recent Federal Court of Appeal decision that looked and reviewed parts of Justice Gleeson's decision, but on the entirety of it, the majority of Justice Gleeson's decision remains current in its form of law, and that thus, NCIRA, which is of course the new oversight body, released a long report analyzing Justice Gleeson's decision. But the most fascinating part about their analysis was that while NCIRA's report found that there were indeed grave breakdowns in the way that the duty of candor worked, and that NCIRA further found that CSIS has not always shared relevant information even within the Justice Department. The question was really not about why does CSIS feel that there's this potential impunity? Why does the Justice Department feel that there's a potential impunity? Rather, the question that NCIRA proposed had far more to do with a question of jurisdiction, with a question of how information was being shared, with a question of how DOJ lawyers were handling information. And one of the most fascinating excerpts from the NCIRA decision looked and closely examined how morale was diminishing at CSIS because DOJ lawyers weren't working with them appropriately. And I think that's one of the most fundamentally interesting parts of how we look at truth and how we look at truth telling. On one hand, you have Canadian Muslims deeply alarmed and suspicious, given the fact that CSIS didn't uphold its duty of candor in relation to what it was doing to obtain warrants. On the other hand, the NCIRA report, and of course, organizations like NCCM, incredibly supported the creation of NCIRA as a critical oversight body. What happens when the oversight body looks at such a situation and responds by saying, morale at CSIS is looking slim, folks, it's looking slim, because DOJ lawyers are not necessarily super helping them in doing what they need to do. I think that is largely what I want us to stay thinking about and to stay focused on. As we look forward and we look backwards since 9/11, I think one of the critical points that remains and that will continue to remain, of course, even as of last month, is how do we continue to think about truth telling? How do we continue to think about lies? And how do we continue to think about the noble lies that are told to us? Thank you.